Deep Dive, Sable Offshore. Part 1. The Sable Story. Before we go into the Sable story, let's first explore how these offshore fixed production platforms work. Think of the whole operation as three big stages: the foundation, the extraction, and the processing lab, with a critical pipeline at the end. 1. The foundation. Fixed steel jackets. These aren't floating ships like you see in movies. Platforms Hondo, Harmony, and Heritage are fixed steel jacket structures, basically giant, immovable steel skeletons pinned to the ocean floor. The jacket itself is this huge, open framework tower made of steel legs and cross-bracing. It sits right on the seabed. To lock it in place permanently, they drove enormous steel piles, think giant pipes, hundreds of feet deep straight through the legs into the sediment below. Once pinned like that, the whole thing becomes rock solid. It doesn't bob or sway even in 50-foot Pacific swells or hurricane-force winds. That absolute stability is why they can run 112 wells directly connected to the platform deck with rigid steel risers. No flexible hoses needed. 2. The extraction. Pulling the well stream. Down below the seabed, there's a whole network of 112 wells. Back in the early days, the reservoir pressure was high and oil would rush out. Decades later, that natural drive is mostly gone. So now they use gas lift, a form of artificial lift. They take high-pressure natural gas, pump it back down the wells, where it mixes with the heavy crude. The gas makes the oil lighter and fizzy, almost like carbonating a drink. That buoyancy helps push the mixture all the way to the surface. What actually arrives topside isn't clean oil. It's a hot, high-pressure mess called the well stream. Crude oil plus salty produced water plus natural gas all mixed together. 3. The processing. 3-phase separation. The top side, the part you see above the waterline, is basically a floating chemical plant designed to sort that mess. Everything flows into large, horizontal separation tanks. Gas, lightest, rises to the very top, captured and compressed. Oil floats in the middle layer. Water, heaviest full of salt and sometimes sand, sinks to the bottom. After separation, the produced water gets treated, oil and solids stripped out. Then most of it is re-injected back into the reservoir to help maintain underground pressure. The oil, now much drier and more stable, can be safely pumped through the subsea pipeline to shore. 4. The Transit Las Flores Canyon (LFC) pipeline. This is the make-or-break link. After processing, the oil and gas head through two subsea lines, Line 324 and Line 325, about 8 miles to the Las Flores Canyon onshore facility. At LFC, oil gets desalted and final treated to pipeline/refinery specs. Gas is sweetened, sulfur removed, so it can be sold into the California power grid. Quick side note on the 2015 spill, that leak happened on this very pipeline system. Since then, Sable has installed 27 new emergency shutoff valves and run multiple smart pigs, those robotic inspection tools that crawl inside the pipe, to prove the 35-plus-year-old steel is still sound and safe for high-pressure flow. Since the 2015 incident, integrity management protocols have evolved from reactive maintenance to a proactive, multi-layered defense strategy. This overhaul focuses on a combination of physical hardware upgrades, such as replacing vulnerable segments and installing automated shutoff valves, and advanced diagnostic oversight through smart pig inline inspections. By integrating enhanced corrosion monitoring specifically targeted at corrosion under insulation (CUI), and implementing rigorous hydrostatic spike testing, the current framework aims to identify and eliminate latent structural weaknesses before they can pose a threat to live operations. Right now, the platforms are shifting from static mode, everything shut in, oil just sitting in the pipes, back to dynamic mode. Full production flowing again, roughly $3 million worth of oil per day at current prices. The biggest operational question mark isn't the old reservoir or the platforms themselves. It's whether all those decades-old seals, valves, and fittings can safely handle the sudden return of high-pressure, high-temperature flow without issues. That's the system in a nutshell. All right, let's walk through this diagram together that summarizes the entire process. It's a great visual breakdown of how these fixed offshore production platforms in the Santa Ynez Unit work, from seabed to shore. It's labeled with the 4 main stages: foundation, extraction, processing, and transit. I'll describe what you're seeing section by section. 1. The foundation, fixed steel jackets. On the left you've got the three platforms, Hondo, Harmony, and Heritage, shown as these tall, towering steel structures standing straight up from the ocean floor. These aren't floating. They're fixed steel jackets, basically massive, open framework steel skeletons bolted to the seabed. See those giant legs going down? Those are pinned permanently with steel piles, enormous pipes driven hundreds of feet deep into the sediment below the seabed. That's what makes them rock solid. No swaying in 50-foot Pacific swells or high winds. That immovable stability is key, because it lets them connect all 112 wells directly to the platform deck, using rigid steel risers. No flexible hoses that could fail under movement. 2. The extraction, pulling the well stream. Moving right, the diagram zooms in on the wells themselves. Down in the reservoir, way below the seabed, pressure has dropped after decades of production, so oil doesn't gush out naturally anymore. They use gas lift for artificial lift. High-pressure natural gas gets injected down the wells. See the yellow arrows and lightning bolt symbol. That gas mixes with the heavy crude, making it lighter and fizzy, like bubbles in soda, creating buoyancy that pushes the whole mixture up to the surface. What comes up isn't pure oil, it's this hot, pressurized well stream, a swirling mix of crude oil, salty produced water, and natural gas. The diagram shows it rising through the risers in that orange/yellow flow path. 3. The processing three-phase separation. Topside, on the platform deck above water, it's like a floating chemical refinery. The well stream flows into big horizontal separation tanks, shown as that layered yellow/orange-blue tank. Gravity does the sorting in three phases. Gas, the lightest, rises right to the top, gets captured, compressed, and sent off. Oil floats in the middle layer. Once most water and gas are out, it's drier and stable enough for transport. Orange arrow out. Water heaviest, loaded with salt and sand, sinks to the bottom. Blue layer. It's treated to remove oil/solids, then re-injected back underground to help maintain reservoir pressure. Blue arrow down. 4. The transit, Las Flores Canyon, LFC. Pipeline. From there, the processed oil and gas head through subsea pipelines, Line 324 and Line 325, about 8 miles to the onshore Las Flores Canyon facility. At LFC, oil gets desalted and final treated to refinery specs. Gas is sweetened, sulfur stripped out, so it can feed into the California power grid. The bottom right flags the critical stuff. After the 2015 spill on this same pipeline system, Sable Offshore Corp installed 27 new emergency shutoff valves and ran multiple smart pigs, those robotic inspection tools that crawl inside the pipe, to confirm the 35-plus-year-old steel is still sound. Now the whole setup is shifting from static mode, everything shut in, oil sitting in pipes, to dynamic mode, full flow restarting, potentially worth around $3 million a day at current prices. The big operational red flag? Those aging seals, valves, and fittings. Can they handle the sudden slam of high-pressure, high-temperature flow without leaking or failing? That's the full workflow in one graphic. Immovable foundation, gas-lifted extraction, topside separation, and shore-bound transit, with some serious safety and restart drama layered on top. So that's the nuts and bolts of how these platforms pull oil from the seabed, process it topside, and get it ready to ship to shore. Now let's zoom out and talk about what all this actually means in the bigger picture, because the story around Sable Offshore Corp isn't just about rusty pipes and gas lift anymore. It's become one of the most complicated, high-stakes turnaround plays in the entire U.S. energy space right now. The saga of Sable Offshore Corp represents one of the most intricate and high-stakes special situations in the modern energy sector, characterized by a collision between legacy industrial infrastructure, evolving environmental jurisprudence, and the opportunistic deployment of distressed capital. Platforms Hondo, Harmony, Heritage plotted offshore, label 3-mile state waters line and federal OCS waters beyond it. Draw subsea flow lines from platforms to Las Flores Canyon, LFC, onshore facility. Show lines 324 and 325 running from LFC inland. Note, formerly 901 900/3. Highlight the tilde 8-mile offshore to LFC segment and the tilde 4 mile coastal segment on state lands/state parks easement as a red regulatory choke point. Offshore production is federally governed. The onshore coastal segments create the permitting bottleneck. At the center of this maelstrom lies the Santa Ynez Unit, SYU, a world-class offshore oil and gas development located in federal waters off the coast of Santa Barbara County, California, comprising 3 massive platforms, Hondo, Harmony, and Heritage, and the onshore Las Flores Canyon, LFC, processing facility. The asset base possesses the theoretical capacity to produce over 45,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. But how much is that really? At 45,000 barrels a day, this asset is a rounding error versus major public E&Ps. It's approximately 1/45th of ConocoPhillips, approximately 1/75th of BP, and roughly 1/95 to 100th of Exxon or Chevron. The log scale shows it clearly sits in small producer territory, meaningfully larger than a single well or micro E&P, but nowhere near integrated or even large independent scale. Against countries, 45,000 barrels per day is negligible. It's approximately 1/20th of Venezuela, approximately 1/90th of Iraq, approximately 1/110th of Canada, and approximately 1/200th of Saudi Arabia, Russia, or the US. This frames the number correctly: material for a single asset or niche operator, immaterial in any national or global supply context. In plain terms, at 45,000 barrels a day, refers to the combined peak production of the entire Santa Ynez Unit when all 3 platforms and the Las Flores Canyon facility were fully operating. It is not a per well or per platform number. Taken together, that output level is a reasonable historical benchmark for the full SYU at capacity and is the reference point behind Sable's current production expectations. The SYU targets the Hondo, Pescado, and Zacate fields, located in the western portion of the Santa Barbara Channel. These fields tap into the Monterey Formation, a geological stratum famous for its prolific but challenging hydrocarbon reserves. The crude oil produced here is generally heavy, low API gravity, and sour, high sulfur content, necessitating sophisticated heating and processing infrastructure to ensure flow assurance and marketability. The location is physically benign in terms of weather, protected from the open Pacific swell by the Channel Islands, but politically volatile, lying adjacent to the Gaviota Coast, a region with a rich history of environmental activism and strict land use controls. The reserves are substantial. Prior to the 2015 shutdown, the unit was a cornerstone of California's domestic energy supply. Even after a decade of dormancy, the reservoir pressure remains sufficient to support free-flowing wells, as evidenced by the restart tests on Platform Harmony in May 2025, which achieved rates of approximately 6,000 barrels per day from just 6 wells. That's like restarting a long-idle factory and having 6 machines alone produce the output of a small oil field, roughly 1 full modern offshore platform's worth of production coming from a handful of wells. In everyday terms, approximately 6,000 barrels per day is enough oil to fuel over 300,000 cars every single day, from just 6 wells that had been shut for nearly a decade. Restart risk is nonlinear after a decade shut-in. The May 2025 Harmony test, approximately 6,000 barrels per day from just 6 wells, is a strong proof-of-life signal, but it does not guarantee a smooth return across all 112 wells. Some wellbores may require workovers due to scale, sand, valve reliability, or flowline restrictions, and ramping can be volatile. Early flush rates can fade as pressure normalization, water cut, and lift optimization settle into a steadier decline curve. The operational reality is usually phased reactivation, prioritizing the highest confidence wells first, while diagnosing underperformers and managing facility constraints. The offshore operations of the Santa Ynez Unit, SYU, are anchored by 3 integrated platforms situated in federal waters on the Outer Continental Shelf, OCS, a designation beginning 3 nautical miles from the coastline. This geographic positioning is the cornerstone of Sable's legal strategy. By operating beyond the state's boundary, the extraction activity falls under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, OCSLA, and federal agencies like BOE and BSE. By establishing that production is governed by federal law rather than state oversight, Sable effectively silos California's regulatory leverage to the onshore and coastal interfaces, such as pipeline easements and export pathways, while insulating the offshore production itself from state-level interference. Platform Hondo, the pioneer. Platform Hondo is the oldest and most proximate facility in the Triad. Hondo is located approximately 5.1 miles offshore in the Santa Barbara Channel, a position in federal waters that underpins Sable's argument that its operations fall under interstate commerce. Installed in 1976, Hondo is an 8-leg jacket platform standing in 842 feet of water with capacity for 28 well slots. It functions as the primary gathering hub for the eastern portion of the field and was the first platform to begin production in 1981, ultimately producing nearly 190 million barrels of oil and 425 billion cubic feet of gas. Now approaching 50 years of service, Hondo also carries the highest integrity risk among the offshore assets. The submerged steel jacket requires continuous cathodic protection to prevent corrosion, and the topside processing equipment, largely dating to the late 1970s, faces obsolescence challenges that add complexity to the restart effort. Platform Harmony, the deepwater hub. Platform Harmony represents a generational leap in offshore engineering compared with Hondo, and sits at the center of Sable's restart strategy. Located roughly 6.4 miles offshore in the Santa Barbara Channel, Harmony extends into much deeper water and reflects a later era of platform design. Installed in June 1989, it stands in approximately 1,198 feet of water, making it one of the deepest conventional fixed platforms ever built on the U.S. West Coast. The structure is substantially larger than Hondo, with 60 well slots and a multi-level modular deck configuration. Operationally, Harmony is the logistical and technical hub of the restart effort. It hosted the May 2025 well tests that demonstrated reservoir viability and is equipped with advanced gas compression and treating systems specifically designed to manage the high hydrogen sulfide content of production from the Pescado field. Platform Heritage, the Western Outpost. Platform Heritage is the westernmost outpost of the Santa Ynez Unit, targeting the Zacate and Pescado fields and located roughly 8 miles offshore in the Santa Barbara Channel. Installed in 1980, Heritage stands in approximately 1,075 feet of water and closely mirrors Platform Harmony in scale, with capacity for 60 well slots. Strategically, Heritage provides access to reserves that cannot be reached from the other platforms, making it essential to full field development. Its production is tied back to Harmony via subsea pipelines laid along the ocean floor, and these subsea connections introduce a distinct risk profile. They are far more difficult to inspect, monitor, and repair than topside equipment, creating maintenance and integrity challenges that differ materially from those faced at the surface facilities. The technical evolution and physical scale of the unit are defined by the progression from the 1976 installation of Platform Hondo to the 1989 editions of Harmony and Heritage. While Hondo operates in 842 feet of water with 28 well slots, the newer deepwater platforms, Harmony and Heritage, stand in depths of up to 1,198 feet and offer 60 well slots each. Spanning a distance of 5 to 8 miles offshore, these three structures have combined to produce hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, serving integrated roles in extraction, compression, and gathering. That offshore system, however, represents only the front end of a tightly coupled production chain. Offshore platforms can drill, complete, and initially separate hydrocarbons, but they cannot deliver a saleable product on their own. The economic viability of the Santa Ynez Unit depends on moving production from the platforms to a centralized onshore facility capable of handling the complexity of the reservoir's output. High water cut, sediments, and significant concentrations of sour gas make untreated production unsafe and unmarketable. As a result, the offshore infrastructure is functionally inseparable from the onshore processing system that conditions the hydrocarbons to meet refinery and pipeline specifications. Onshore processing. The Las Flores Canyon (LFC) facility. The hydrocarbons extracted offshore are unmarketable in their raw state. They contain water, sediments, and lethal concentrations of sour gas. The fluid stream is transported via subsea pipelines to the Las Flores Canyon, LFC, processing facility tucked into a canyon on the Gaviota coast. Processing capabilities. LFC is a massive industrial complex designed to separate the three-phase flow: oil, gas, water. It dehydrates the crude to refinery specifications and sweetens the natural gas by removing sulfur. Power generation. A critical feature of LFC is its cogeneration plant. The facility uses a portion of the produced natural gas to fire turbines that generate electricity. This power is used to run the facility and is transmitted via subsea cables to the offshore platforms to power the drilling rigs and lift pumps. Excess power is sold into the California grid, providing a secondary, albeit minor, revenue stream. Storage constraints. The facility includes storage tanks for the treated crude. However, storage is finite. During the May 2025 testing, Sable produced oil into these tanks until they reached capacity. Without an export route, the pipeline, production had to cease. This physical bottleneck highlights the absolute necessity of the pipeline restart. Without it, LFC is merely a storage terminal with no outlet. The logistical umbilical. The Las Flores pipeline system. The entire SYU complex relies on a single artery to reach the market: the Las Flores pipeline system. This system consists of two primary segments: Line 324, formerly Line 901, a 2.4-inch diameter insulated pipeline that transports crude oil from LFC to the Sisquoc pump station. This is the specific line that ruptured in the 2015 Refugio spill. Line 325, formerly Line 903, a 3.0-inch diameter pipeline that continues from Sisquoc to the Pentland delivery point in Kern County. These pipelines are insulated with polyurethane foam and tape wrap to maintain the temperature of the viscous crude oil, ensuring it remains fluid enough to pump. This specific insulation design has become the system's Achilles heel. Flow assurance is an underrated restart variable for SYU's heavy, sour crude. Viscosity rises rapidly as temperature drops, so stable transport depends on temperature management, insulation integrity, heating where applicable, disciplined restart procedures, and operational controls that prevent cooling-induced throughput loss or plugging risks. Any degradation in insulation, heat tracing, or temperature control systems increases restart fragility, especially during low-flow conditions, because heavy crude becomes harder to move exactly when the system is most vulnerable. These assets have remained largely dormant, shut in, since the catastrophic Refugio oil spill in May 2015, creating a decade-long hiatus that has degraded physical integrity and hardened regulatory opposition. Since the 2015 Refugio spill, the response has focused on removing the original failure mechanism and making the pipeline inspectable and defensible under modern standards. The first image shows direct excavation of the onshore pipeline, where sections were uncovered, insulation removed, and damaged pipe cut out and replaced. This work addressed the core problem revealed by the spill: corrosion hidden beneath polyurethane foam insulation that trapped moisture against the steel and prevented visual inspection. By exposing the pipe, operators were able to identify wall loss, repair affected segments, and pressure test the system well above normal operating limits. The second image illustrates the pipeline's insulation design: steel pipe surrounded by polyurethane foam and an outer protective sheath, with an ORM, online corrosion monitoring system, embedded inside. Since 2015, this design has been systematically mitigated through targeted insulation removal, enhanced corrosion monitoring, smart pig inspections, and stricter integrity management plans. The goal was not to redesign the entire system, but to prove that the insulation-related corrosion risk could be detected, managed, and prevented rather than hidden. This remediation effort resolves the engineering question, but it exposes the real one. With the physical failure mode addressed and the pipeline repaired and tested, the remaining barrier to restart is no longer technical. It is regulatory authority and legal jurisdiction, which determines whether a repaired pipeline is allowed to operate at all. This shift from engineering to authority reframes the entire debate. Once the physical integrity of the system was addressed, the fate of the asset ceased to be a question of safety or operability and became a question of who has the legal power to decide whether the pipeline may restart. The investment thesis is therefore predicated on a binary outcome: the successful restart of the Las Flores pipeline system, lines 324 and 325, and the unlocking of substantial free cash flow from assets acquired at a fraction of their replacement cost. The investment thesis is predicated on a binary outcome: the successful restart of the Las Flores pipeline system, lines 324 and 325, and the subsequent unlocking of substantial free cash flow from assets acquired at a fraction of their replacement cost. However, as of January 2026, this thesis faces an existential threat. Following a precipitous 75% collapse in equity value from when Lilu bought it, is driven by a federal court admission that the onshore pipelines remain inactive and thus subject to draconian new state permitting requirements under California Senate Bill 237, SB 237. Sable Offshore stands at a precipice. This report provides an exhaustive analysis of the physical, legal, and financial dimensions of Sable Offshore. It explores the technical specifications of the stranded assets, the metallurgical and operational implications of an 11-year shutdown, the complex jurisdictional war between the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, and the California Coastal Commission, CCC, and the precarious financial structure that now threatens the company's solvency. Before we get there, we have to ask, so why did Exxon sell off Sable in the first place? To understand the current crisis, you have to understand that Sable Offshore Corp did not begin as a typical oil company. It began as a high-stakes financial vehicle designed specifically to solve a problem that a global giant like ExxonMobil simply couldn't fix. The SPAC origins Flame Acquisition Corp. The story of Sable is inextricably linked to the world of blank check companies. In early 2024, the entity we now call Sable was born from a merger with Flame Acquisition Corp., a special-purpose acquisition company, SPAC, led by industry veteran James C. Flores. Flores is no stranger to the Santa Barbara Channel. He previously led Plains Exploration and Production, which had deep roots in California offshore. He formed Flame with a singular, audacious thesis: that a lean, aggressive, independent operator could navigate the regulatory graveyard of California, where a multi-billion-dollar major like Exxon had failed. The transaction valued the pro forma entity at approximately $883 million. It was a zombie deal from the start. Exxon didn't just sell the assets, they effectively became the bank, providing 97% of the financing through a $625 million senior secured term loan. Why Exxon walked away? For decades, the Santa Ynez Unit was Exxon's crown jewel in the U.S., producing oil for as little as $16 per barrel. However, following the 2015 Refugio spill, the math changed. Exxon spent 7 years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to restart the unit, but they were met with a wall of political and legal resistance. By the time Exxon exited, the financial damage was already locked in. Public filings and reporting show Exxon took multi-billion-dollar impairment charges, roughly $2.6 billion, largely tied to the prolonged shutdown of the Santa Ynez Unit and the failure to restart it. Those write-downs reflected years of engineering work, regulatory compliance, litigation, and carrying costs with no viable path forward. In effect, Exxon concluded that continuing to fight for a restart would only compound losses, while the asset's future value was being steadily eroded by politics rather than geology or economics. Exxon realized that as a global multinational, they were a lightning rod for environmental litigation. They faced two insurmountable hurdles. 1. The trucking denied when Santa Barbara County blocked their plan to truck oil to refineries to bypass the broken pipeline. Exxon saw the writing on the wall. 2. The decommissioning bill. The Titans, Hondo, Harmony, and Heritage were approaching the end of their lives. The cost to remove these structures and plug the wells is estimated at over $500 million. By selling to Sable, Exxon attempted a strategic liability handoff. They outsourced the regulatory street fight to Jim Flores while maintaining a massive financial stake through their loan. The binary bet and the reversion clause. The most critical part of this history is the reversion clause embedded in the sale. Exxon didn't just hand over the keys, they set a ticking clock. If Sable failed to restart production by a specific date, originally set for late 2025 and later pushed into early 2026, the assets would revert back to Exxon for zero compensation. Please note, the Sable situation has two separate, easily confused clocks: the asset reversion clock and the debt maturity clock. The reversion clause was the original binary threat. If Sable failed to restart production by a set deadline, initially late 2025, later pushed into early 2026, the assets would revert to Exxon for zero compensation, wiping out equity outright. That risk has effectively passed due to extensions and regulatory progress. What remains is the 2027 clock, which is not about losing the assets, but about surviving financially. The Exxon note matures on March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first oil sales, meaning Sable must either generate cash flow fast enough or refinance on acceptable terms, with dilution as the main danger rather than automatic forfeiture. This created a binary outcome for investors. If the pipeline restarts, the company unlocks billions in value. If it doesn't, the equity is wiped out and the scrap metal returns to Exxon. Whether the upside or the wipeout occurs does not hinge on sentiment, oil prices, or capital markets. It hinges on a single question: can an oil transportation system that failed catastrophically and then sat dormant for more than a decade be brought back online without failing again? Part 2. The 11-year shutdown: corrosion, integrity, and the physics of dormancy. The shutdown of the SYU in May 2015 was not a planned decommissioning. It was an emergency stop following a failure. In industrial systems, an 11-year shutdown is not preservation, it is entropy. Over that span, mechanical integrity degrades, safety systems lose reliability, and restart feasibility becomes uncertain. While steel structures do experience an initial period of stress relaxation after installation, long-term dormancy does not produce a stable equilibrium. In pressurized pipeline systems, safety depends on active control: flow, temperature, pressure cycling, corrosion inhibition, and continuous monitoring. When a line is shut in for years, protective conditions decay. Residual moisture and contaminants settle into low points. Oxygen ingress becomes uneven. Cathodic protection systems lose effectiveness. Seals and coatings age, and localized corrosion mechanisms accelerate rather than stabilize. In practice, extended inactivity increases uncertainty around wall thickness, defect growth, and material toughness, meaning that an 11-year shutdown leaves a pipeline less predictable, not more settled, than one kept in controlled operation. The 2015 Refugio spill, origin of the crisis: on May 19, 2015, line 901, now line 324, ruptured, releasing roughly 140,000 gallons of crude oil. Approximately 21,000 gallons reached the Pacific Ocean via a culvert under Highway 100 and fouling beaches and killing wildlife. The failure was traced to external corrosion that reduced the pipe wall to a fraction of its design thickness. The regulatory response was swift and severe. The operator at the time, Plains All-American Pipeline, faced criminal charges and entered a federal consent decree. The assets later passed to ExxonMobil, which ultimately sold them to Sable Offshore in 2024 after failing to restart the system under California's regulatory regime. The failure mechanism identified in 2015 remains the central technical issue today. The Refugio spill released approximately 140,000 gallons of crude oil, of which about 21,000 gallons reached the Pacific Ocean, making it one of the most significant coastal oil spills in California history. The incident resulted in the deaths of roughly 350 birds, impacted marine mammals, forced the closure of multiple beaches, and disrupted fishing and tourism along the Santa Barbara coast. Cleanup, remediation, and legal settlements ultimately cost around $63 million. While small in scale compared to major disasters like Exxon Valdez, about 10.8 million gallons, or Deepwater Horizon, about 134 million gallons, Refugio's location in a highly visible, environmentally sensitive, and politically active region gave it a disproportionately large social and regulatory impact, hardening public opposition to offshore oil and reshaping California's regulatory stance for the next decade. Corrosion mechanisms, CUI, and NYSE. The prolonged shutdown amplified two distinct corrosion risks. 1. Corrosion under insulation, CUI. Corrosion under insulation, CUI, occurs when the insulation wrapped around a pipeline used to keep heavy crude warm enough to flow begins to fail and allows water to penetrate. Once moisture becomes trapped between the insulation and a warm steel pipe, it creates a high-humidity microenvironment that aggressively accelerates corrosion. The image illustrates this failure mode clearly. Water seeps beneath the insulation, rust spreads along the pipe surface, and corrosion progresses unseen. Critically, the insulation also creates a shielding effect, acting as a dielectric barrier that prevents cathodic protection current from reaching the steel. When this happens, corrosion is no longer actively mitigated and can advance unchecked. This exact mechanism, hidden corrosion beneath intact-looking insulation, was identified as the direct cause of the 2015 rupture and remains the primary technical concern of regulators today. 2. Microbiologically influenced corrosion, MIC. Microbiologically influenced corrosion becomes a serious risk when pipeline flow stops and entrained water settles along the bottom of the line. In stagnant conditions, sulfate-reducing bacteria can proliferate within this trapped water, forming biofilms on the steel surface and producing hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. These biofilms create highly localized electrochemical corrosion cells that aggressively pit the pipe wall from the inside. Under normal operation, continuous flow suppresses MIC by sweeping away water and microbial colonies, but during prolonged dormancy the process accelerates unchecked, thinning the steel internally and often remaining undetected until a leak or rupture occurs. This image illustrates microbiologically influenced corrosion, MIC, a process where stagnant conditions allow sulfate-reducing bacteria to settle at the bottom of a pipe and form protective biofilms. These bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide, H2S, as a byproduct, which creates highly localized and aggressive pitting that bores deep into the steel rather than thinning it evenly. While active flow typically suppresses this biome by sweeping microbes and water away, a dormant or stagnant line allows these colonies to eat through the pipe wall from the inside, often remaining undetected until a sudden failure or rupture occurs. The condition of the pipelines during the shutdown is a core dispute. Sable Offshore's position is that the lines were evacuated, cleaned, and preserved with inert nitrogen shortly after shutdown. In theory, a nitrogen-filled pipeline excludes oxygen and moisture, which would halt internal corrosion. The regulatory and environmental counterpoint is that pipeline cleaning is never perfect. Residuals, sludge, scale, and water almost always remain, especially in low points and deadlegs that nitrogen purge cannot fully reach. Over an 11-year period, even small amounts of trapped moisture can sustain localized microbiologically influenced corrosion. Nitrogen preservation also does nothing to address external corrosion under insulation, which was the original failure mode. The next debate is about restart risk. Restarting the system is not a simple valve open event. Introducing hot oil into a cold pipeline causes thermal expansion. If corrosion has thinned the pipe wall, that thermal stress can trigger a rupture. At the same time, thousands of seals, gaskets, and O-rings across the Las Flores Canyon facility and the offshore platforms have been dormant for more than a decade. Many of these components will have hardened or lost elasticity. As a result, minor to moderate leaks during initial repressurization are statistically likely. This is why regulators insist on hydrostatic and spike testing. These tests are designed to conclusively expose integrity weaknesses before oil is introduced. From Sable's perspective, that testing is dangerous. A spike test risks converting uncertainty into proof of structural failure, and a test-induced rupture could be fatal to the asset. After more than a decade of dormancy, the primary risk to the Las Flores pipeline system is not whether corrosion exists. It is whether those risks are understood, bounded, and provably mitigated. Since 2015, Sable has focused on eliminating the original failure mode, exposing and repairing degraded pipe, improving corrosion monitoring, and restoring integrity management systems that decay during inactivity. Counterintuitively, hydrostatic testing and controlled restart reduce risk after long shutdowns by forcing hidden weaknesses to reveal themselves under controlled conditions rather than during live oil flow. Dormancy increases uncertainty. Testing and restart convert uncertainty into measurable, regulated operating limits, which is why regulators insist on them and why a successfully tested pipeline is safer than one left idle indefinitely. Part 3. Case Studies. To see how this could play out, let's look at the historical precedents that map closest to Sable's situation: Mountain Valley, Dakota Access, Keystone XL, Colonial, and Trans Mountain. Each one shows a different path: clean legislative win, messy operational survival, total federal preemption failure, energy security leverage, or political risk so bad even the big boys walk away. Comparative case studies, lessons for Sable Offshore from past pipeline battles. Let's start with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP. This is the golden ticket precedent, the best case scenario where regulatory gridlock gets smashed by direct federal intervention. But when you dig in, the mechanism was very specific and it highlights some key differences for Sable. The regulatory nightmare for MVP went through the same endless litigation loop we're seeing with Sable's pipelines. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals kept blocking things, vacating permits from the Fish and Wildlife Service and Bureau of Land Management over and over. Environmental groups like the Sierra Club and Appalachian Voices would sue every time a permit came through. The court would issue stays or vacate the permits, stopping construction cold. This dragged on for more than 5 years, ballooning costs from $3.5 billion to almost $7.85 billion. By 2022-23, the pipeline was over 90% physically built but legally frozen. How it got unstuck? The Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. The breakthrough didn't come from winning in court. It came from changing the law itself. Senator Joe Manchin used his leverage on the debt ceiling bill to slip in Section 324 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It explicitly ratified and approved all existing MVP permits. It stripped the Fourth Circuit of jurisdiction over future challenges and moved any constitutional questions to the D.C. Circuit. When the Fourth Circuit tried to issue stays anyway, the Supreme Court stepped in during July 2023, vacated those stays, and let construction finish. These past pipeline fights show that projects like Sable don't usually get resolved by slowly winning in court. They get resolved when something outside the normal legal process breaks the stalemate. In the Mountain Valley Pipeline case, years of lawsuits and regulatory delays didn't end because the company argued better. It ended because Congress stepped in and changed the rules. Lawmakers explicitly approved the project, took power away from the court that kept blocking it, and the Supreme Court enforced that decision. The lesson for Sable is that when a pipeline becomes economically or politically important enough, the outcome often shifts from a legal debate to a political one. Courts can delay projects for years, but they rarely have the final word once federal priorities, energy security, or legislative action come into play. The big difference for Sable: executive versus legislative power. Sable is trying to copy the MVP playbook, but with a weaker tool. MVP used an act of Congress, raw legislative override. Sable is relying on the executive branch, PHMSA reclassifying the pipeline as interstate, and President Trump's National Energy Emergency Declaration. The Supreme Court backed MVP because Congress can change laws and strip jurisdiction. Executive actions and agency decisions face Administrative Procedure Act review and are far more vulnerable to judicial reversal. Sable is chasing the same outcome with a less reliable weapon. In simple terms, Mountain Valley won because Congress changed the rules, which courts have to respect. Sable is trying to get the same result, but instead of a new law, it's relying on actions by federal agencies and the president. That approach can work, but it's shakier because courts can review and potentially overturn executive or agency decisions. So, Sable is aiming for the same endgame as Mountain Valley Federal Authority, breaking the deadlock but using a tool that's easier for judges to challenge. Next up, Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, the messy win precedent. If MVP is the clean victory, DAPL is the gritty survival mode example, and this looks like the path Sable is actually walking. The Standing Rock fight, the core case, was Standing Rock Sioux Tribe v. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It centered on whether the Corps violated NEPA by not doing a full environmental impact statement for the Lake Oahe crossing. In 2020, Judge Boasberg ruled yes, vacated the easement, and ordered the pipeline shut down and emptied. The key appellate ruling, vacatur without shutdown energy transfer, appealed to the D.C. Circuit. And that's where the critical precedent emerged. 1. The court affirmed vacatur. The permit was illegal, so DAPL technically became a squatter on federal land. 2. but it reversed the shutdown order. The district court hadn't properly applied the Allied Signal test for injunctive relief. Under Allied Signal, courts weigh the seriousness of the agency's error against the disruptive consequences of an interim shutdown. Energy Transfer won on the economics. Shutting down DAPL would cause billions in losses, flood the rail system with oil trains, and hammer North Dakota's economy. Those disruptions were big enough to let the pipeline keep operating while NEPA was redone. The Dakota Access fight showed that even when a pipeline's permit is ruled invalid, courts don't automatically shut it down. The appeals court agreed that the government messed up the permitting process, but it said the lower court went too far by ordering the pipeline to stop operating. When judges weighed the real-world damage of a shutdown, billions in losses, oil moving onto trains, and economic harm to an entire region, they decided those consequences were worse than letting the pipeline keep running while the paperwork was fixed. The takeaway is that once a pipeline is operating and economically important, courts become much more reluctant to turn it off, even if there are legal flaws in how it was approved. Sable's DAPL-style play. This is exactly what Sable is positioning for. Step 1. Get oil flowing ASAP. Become an operational incumbent before courts vacate permits. Step 2. If a court later finds PHMSA's interstate designation flawed, argue disruptive consequences. Shutdown would spike California gasoline prices and threaten energy security. CEO Jim Flores is already building this case, framing SYU production as vital to avoiding fuel shortages in California. Through public statements, regulatory filings, and discussions with federal agencies, Flores has emphasized that restarting the Santa Ynez Unit would help stabilize fuel supply and pricing in California and reduce dependence on imported oil. That narrative is meant to matter in court. If judges are asked to weigh a technical permitting flaw against the real-world consequences of shutting down an operating pipeline, higher gasoline prices, supply disruptions, and broader energy risk, Sable wants the balance to tilt toward keeping the oil flowing while any legal issues are sorted out. In plain terms, Sable is trying to follow the same playbook that worked for Dakota Access. The goal is to get oil flowing as quickly as possible so the pipeline becomes part of the real, functioning energy system, not just a proposed project. Once a pipeline is operating, courts are much more reluctant to shut it down, even if they later find problems with the permitting. Keystone XL, the bear case cautionary tale. KXL shows the limits of federal power when states control siting and routing. The federal versus state divide pipeline regulation splits authority. PHMSA, federal, handles safety, construction standards, testing, etc. For cross-border like KXL, the State Department/President handles border crossings. States, via public utility commissions, control siting, routing, and land use. Nebraska's block wall headlines focused on presidential permits. Obama denied, Trump approved, Biden revoked. The real ground-level stall came from the Nebraska Public Service Commission. Opponents argued federal approval didn't override state routing authority. And without a federal eminent domain law for oil pipelines, unlike gas under the Natural Gas Act, TransCanada had to follow state rules. Courts rejected federal preemption claims. In simple terms, Keystone XL shows that federal approval doesn't always win if states control the ground. Even though presidents went back and forth approving and canceling the project, the real roadblock was Nebraska, which had the power to decide where the pipeline could be built. Because oil pipelines don't have the same federal eminent domain rights as gas pipelines, the company still had to follow state siting and routing rules. Courts agreed with the state, and once that happened, federal approval alone wasn't enough to force the project through. Sable's parallel risk. The California Coastal Act. Sable argues the Federal Pipeline Safety Act preempts the state's Coastal Act on restart issues. But the Coastal Commission counters with the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, which lets states review projects for consistency with coastal plans. If the Ninth Circuit follows KXL logic, PHMSA can approve safety, but the state can still block on land use or spill risk grounds. Result: a federally safe pipeline that can't legally operate without state siting approval. Classic KXL outcome. Sable may win on safety but still lose on permission. Even if federal regulators say the pipeline is safe to operate, California can argue it still has the right to block it under coastal land use and spill risk rules. If courts agree, Sable could end up with a pipeline that's federally approved but legally unable to run without state sign-off. The same trap that ultimately stopped Keystone XL. Colonial Pipeline. The energy security leverage play. This isn't about construction, it's about operational criticality. The 2021 ransomware attack gives hard data on disruption shocks, which Sable is using as its main lobbying weapon. The 2021 Crisis DarkSide ransomware forced Colonial to shut its 5,500-mile system, cutting fuel to the East Coast. Panic buying emptied stations across the Southeast. Prices spiked, flights rerouted over jet fuel shortages. The government reacted fast. Biden waived Jones Act rules for foreign tankers and relaxed EPA fuel specs. It proved that in real energy crises, rules bend. The Colonial Pipeline hack showed what happens when a major fuel artery suddenly stops. Gas stations ran dry, prices jumped, and airlines had to adjust flights because fuel wasn't available. Faced with immediate disruption, the government quickly relaxed shipping and fuel rules that normally take years to change. The lesson is that when energy supply is threatened, regulations that seem rigid on paper can bend very quickly in practice. Sable's Energy Island framing. Sable is trying to reframe the fight away from environmental permitting and toward energy security. By calling California an energy island, Jim Flores is arguing that the state is unusually vulnerable because it's largely cut off from national pipeline networks and depends heavily on imported oil and fuel. That makes any disruption, whether from regulation, litigation, or infrastructure shutdowns, far more damaging than in states that can easily pull supply from elsewhere. The December 2025 National Energy Emergency Declaration is meant to reinforce that framing. Sable's goal is to put its pipelines in the same mental category as the Colonial Pipeline during the ransomware attack. Not just an industrial asset, but critical infrastructure. If courts accept that blocking the Santa Ynez pipelines meaningfully threatens fuel availability, price stability, or broader economic security in California, they may be more willing to allow operations to continue while legal disputes are resolved. In effect, Sable is betting that once the issue is seen as keeping the lights on rather than approving a permit, judges and regulators will prioritize continuity of supply over procedural objections. Trans Mountain Expansion TMX, the unquantifiable risk exit TMX in Canada shows when political risk becomes uninsurable for big players. Kinder Morgan's capitulation in 2018, Kinder Morgan stopped spending on TMX amid deadlock between anti-pipeline British Columbia and pro-pipeline Alberta. They called it unquantifiable risk. No engineering or capital could fix the politics, and forced the Canadian government to buy it for Canadian $4.5 billion, nationalizing the headache. The ExxonMobil parallel Exxon's sale of SYU to Sable mirrors this. After the 2015 spill, Exxon faced the same unquantifiable risk in Santa Barbara. County refused trucking permits and repairs, so they wrote down $2.5 billion and exited. Sable bought at distressed prices because Exxon needed a political escape. Unlike majors, Sable, as a single-asset private player, can stomach that risk. It doesn't need broad social license, just a legal one. Exxon walked away because the risk stopped being about oil and started being about politics. After the 2015 spill, Exxon couldn't find a reliable way to move. Oil trucking was blocked, pipeline repairs were stalled, and every step invited lawsuits. As a global company, Exxon couldn't tolerate an open-ended fight in Santa Barbara, so it wrote down roughly $2.5 billion and exited. Sable stepped in because it doesn't have the same constraints. It's a single-asset operator that can take on political and legal risk. Where Exxon needed broad public acceptance to operate, Sable only needs a narrow legal path to get oil flowing. At its core, the Sable Offshore thesis isn't a traditional energy play. It's a high-leverage bet on a specific legal outcome. It blends MVP's legislative override ambition, but via weaker executive tools. DAPL's operational squatting strategy, get flowing fast, then defend with disruptive consequences arguments. Colonial's energy security narrative as PR and legal cover. KXL's structural risk, courts could separate safety from siting, letting state blocks stand. At its core, the Sable Offshore thesis is not a traditional energy investment, but a highly leveraged bet on legal and regulatory outcomes. It combines elements of several past pipeline battles. The ambition of Mountain Valley to break gridlock through federal authority, albeit using weaker executive tools rather than legislation. The Dakota Access strategy of getting oil flowing quickly to gain the protections that come with being an operating asset. The colonial pipeline lesson that energy security concerns can bend rules and reshape enforcement, and the Keystone XL risk that courts may uphold state control over siting even if federal safety approval is secured. The payoff depends on whether these forces align in Sable's favor, or whether the structural limits exposed by Keystone ultimately prevail. Veneco. The scorched earth precedent if Mountain Valley Pipeline is the dream scenario for Sable federal intervention smashing through gridlock, Veneco is the nightmare scenario that keeps investors up at night. Veneco is the direct historical control group. It was the other operator hammered by the exact same 2015 Refugio oil spill, dealing with the same local regulators, same Santa Barbara County environment, and same transportation choke points. Veneco operated Platform Holly, in state waters about 1.52 miles offshore Goleta, and the Elwood Onshore Facility, EOF. Like Sable's Santa Ynez Unit, Veneco relied on the Plains All-American Pipeline System, lines 901 or 903, to move oil to market. When the pipeline ruptured in May 2015, Veneco's revenue dropped to zero overnight. For nearly 2 years, they tried to get temporary trucking permits to haul oil to refineries as a bridge solution. The blockade came from the city of Goleta and the California State Lands Commission delays and denials that bled the company dry financially. The quitclaim exit, April 2017. After burning cash and hitting a wall on permits, Veneco pulled a scorched earth move that Sable must avoid. On April 17, 2017, Veneco filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and simultaneously executed a quitclaim deed, surrendering its leases for the South Elwood field including Platform Holly and related onshore-nearshore assets back to the State Lands Commission. They essentially dropped the keys on the desk and walked away, leaving the state to handle decommissioning. The legal aftermath. The failed takings claim Veneco's liquidating trust later sued the state of California and the State Lands Commission for inverse condemnation, a regulatory taking, seeking around $161 million in compensation. The argument: by denying trucking permits, forcing abandonment, and then occupying/taking over the Elwood onshore facility for decommissioning to manage lethal H2S gas risks, the state had effectively taken private property for public use without just compensation. The ruling, Bankruptcy Court 2022. The court sided with the state. It found that Veneco had created an emergency by threatening to leave the facility unmanned, requiring constant monitoring for public safety and environmental protection. The commission's takeover was an exercise of police power to avert imminent harm, not a compensable taking. Outcome: Veneco investors and creditors got nothing from the claim. The state seized control of the assets, is managing decommissioning at significant taxpayer expense, and effectively killed commercial production there, leaving oil in the ground. In plain English, Veneco ran out of options and chose to walk away completely. After years of burning cash and being blocked from trucking oil, Veneco filed for bankruptcy in April 2017 and literally handed its offshore and onshore assets back to the state of California, leaving the state responsible for shutting them down and cleaning them up. Veneco later argued that the state had effectively taken its property by denying permits and then stepping in to control the facilities, and it sued for compensation. The court rejected that claim, ruling that the state acted to prevent an immediate public safety and environmental risk, not to seize property for profit. The outcome of this was that Veneco investors and creditors recovered nothing. The state took control of the assets, decommissioning moved forward at taxpayer expense, and commercial production in the area was permanently shut down with oil left in the ground. Relevance to Sable. The takings warning: Sable is now threatening a similar inverse condemnation lawsuit, valued at $347 million plus, against Santa Barbara County if local permits are denied outright. The risk. Veneco shows California courts are very willing to frame aggressive regulatory blocks, especially around safety, spill prevention, and H2S hazards, as legitimate police power exercises rather than takings. The key distinction: Veneco's platforms were in state waters, fully under State Lands Commission jurisdiction, while Sable's Santa Ynez Unit is in federal waters, Oxash/Bowen jurisdiction. This gives Sable a stronger federal preemption argument overall. However, the onshore Las Flores Canyon processing facility remains vulnerable, the exact same kind of choke point where Veneco's history could repeat if state-local agencies dig in on siting, safety, or environmental grounds. Veneco is the cautionary tale of what happens when you can't get operational momentum, or federal override total capitulation, bankruptcy, and zero recovery on takings claims. Sable's path depends on avoiding that abandonment trap by restarting under federal authority before state forces can force a similar surrender. Part 4. The Catalysts. This is not a traditional E&P underwriting. It is an event-driven unlock where the market is pricing two questions. 1. Whether Sable can legally restart and sell oil, and 2. How much dilution or refinancing pain sits between today and stable cash flow. Even if oil sales eventually happen, Sable must survive the bridge period to get there. The infographic lays out SOC's restart as a single, compressed race against overlapping regulatory and financing clocks from 2015 to early 2026. It begins with the May 2015 Refugio spill and immediate shutdown, followed by nearly a decade of dormancy marked by repair work, integrity testing, and regulatory compliance efforts. In 2024, the asset changes hands under an Exxon seller financing structure, restarting the economic clock. By May 2025, SOC achieves a limited milestone with a partial restart to storage, but not full sales, leaving the core risk unresolved. The pressure intensifies in late 2025. In September, California's SB 237 adds state-level permitting friction. In November, SOC raises equity and amends its loan with punitive terms, 15% PIK interest and cash covenants, signaling acute liquidity stress. And in December, PHMSA issues an emergency permit while the Ninth Circuit declines to stay federal authority, clarifying the federal path but not eliminating state resistance. The two lower bands make the problem explicit. The regulatory track shows approvals, court actions, and state hearings stacking tightly into early 2026, while the financing track shows capital raises and debt terms hardening as time passes. Both converge on the same choke point, January to February 2026, state permit fights, and ultimately the March 1, 2026 restart and sales deadline, where failure to transition from storage to actual oil sales risks triggering reversion pressure and a binary outcome for the equity. Two political realities sit underneath the legal arguments. California's coastal regulators are structurally hostile to restart, and federal support can be time-bounded. Emergency authorities and special permits are powerful but not permanent renewal cycles, and administration priorities matter. The operational question isn't just can they win once, but whether they can sustain a federal path long enough to establish commercial incumbency. Catalyst 1. Pipeline approval. Fast path. The California blockage thesis weakened on January 2, 2026, when the Ninth Circuit denied an emergency stay requested by environmental groups, allowing Sable to proceed under the federal PHMSA interstate permit. Political delay risk remains, but the legal framework has shifted. The importance of the January 2, 2026 ruling is not that all risk disappeared, but that the center of gravity shifted. By denying the emergency stay, the Ninth Circuit allowed Sable to operate under PHMSA's federal interstate designation, rather than being frozen by California regulators while litigation plays out. That matters because it breaks the pattern of automatic injunctions that kept the pipelines idle for years. From here, opponents must win a full legal challenge to stop operations, rather than stopping the project by default. Political and procedural delay risk still exists, but the baseline has changed from blocked unless approved to allowed unless stopped, which materially improves the odds of oil reaching market and forces the issue onto a faster timeline. Catalyst 2. Exxon note resolution. Make or break. The March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first sales, maturity forces a decision. An extension or credible refinance would shift the story from default risk to funded execution. This is where the bear case is strongest. Exxon could demand punitive terms or heavy dilution. capital markets may remain closed, forcing an expensive or controlled solution. This catalyst matters because it determines who ultimately controls the outcome. The extended maturity buys time, but it does not solve the problem. It simply defers it. Once oil sales begin, the clock accelerates because carrying 15% debt quickly becomes unsustainable. At that point, Sable must either refinance on acceptable terms or negotiate directly with Exxon. If capital markets are open, a refinance converts the company from a distressed situation into a funded operating business. If they are not, Exxon's leverage increases dramatically. Exxon can dictate terms, extract equity, or force a restructuring that preserves the asset but severely impairs shareholders. In other words, success on this catalyst cleanly unlocks value, while failure concentrates downside, making it the clearest make-or-break moment in the entire thesis. Catalyst 3. Offshore storage tanker route. Slower, cleaner jurisdiction. Federal approval for offshore storage and shuttle tankers would materially reduce California's ability to stall the project and improve financing predictability. This path is costly. Meaningful capex, additional financing, delayed first sales, and higher dilution risk, but it can still work if it reframes the project as federally permitted and financeable. This catalyst represents the fallback option if the pipeline path remains contested. By shifting exports offshore and using shuttle tankers, Sable would move the project almost entirely into federal waters, where California's regulatory reach is far weaker. That jurisdictional shift is important for lenders, because it replaces open-ended state interference with a clearer federal permitting regime. The trade-off is cost and time. Retrofitting platforms, securing vessels, and arranging offshore logistics require meaningful capital and likely additional equity, pushing first sales further out and increasing dilution. Even so, this route can still unlock value if it convinces financiers that the project is legally durable and operationally viable, transforming Sable from a politically stalled asset into a federally permitted cash flow story. This is not a traditional oil and gas investment. It's an event-driven situation where the market is really pricing. 2 questions. First, can Sable legally restart operations and sell oil? And second, even if it can, does it have enough financial runway to survive until cash flow stabilizes? Again, the first catalyst is pipeline approval, which is the fast path. In early January 2026, the Ninth Circuit denied an emergency stay sought by environmental groups. That decision weakened the idea that California can indefinitely block the pipeline and allowed Sable to proceed under a federal PHMSA permit. Political and procedural delays are still possible, but the legal backdrop has materially improved. The second catalyst is the Exxon note, and this one is make or break. The debt matures on March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first oil sales. Sable needs an extension or a credible refinancing. This is where the downside risk is concentrated. Exxon could demand punitive terms, and capital markets may not be available, which could result in heavy dilution or loss of control for shareholders. The third catalyst is the offshore storage and tanker route. This is a slower and more expensive alternative, but it shifts the project into cleaner federal jurisdiction and reduces California's ability to stall progress. The trade-offs are meaningful: capex, additional financing needs, delayed first sales, and higher dilution risk. Even so, this path can still work if it reframes the project as federally permitted and financeable. Taken together, the story is simple. The upside exists, but it depends entirely on clearing legal hurdles and surviving the financing bridge. Oil prices don't decide the outcome. Time, capital, and regulatory resolution do. Why this is an investable special situation. 3 factors make this compelling. 1. Built asset. The infrastructure exists and the oil is proven. The question is whether Sable is allowed to move and sell it. 2. Multiple monetization paths: pipeline restart path, offshore storage/tanker path, slower and more capital intensive, but shifts authority to federal agencies and courts. 3. Option-like payoff. This is not a long-duration compounder. If the unlock occurs, the stock can re-rate sharply due to trapped cash flow and short interest. If it fails, the stock can go to zero due to leverage and hard deadlines in the Exxon purchase agreement and term loan. A simple way to frame upside is to translate restart into cash flow. If sustained sales reach about 40K BO/D, Even modest netbacks can imply hundreds of millions of annual EBITDA. Apply a discounted multiple to reflect California risk, then subtract the senior secured debt stack. The equity outcome can still be multiples of today's market cap, but only if the capital structure survives the bridge and refinancing terms don't transfer most of the upside to creditors. The setup is simple. Secure limited approvals and enough financing to reach oil sales. If that happens, the stock works. If not, it doesn't. Part 5. The bear case, invert. Always invert. Okay, let's talk through this part of the Sable Offshore story like we're breaking down a high-stakes investment thesis over a call. The core idea here is that even in California's tough regulatory landscape, Sable isn't pinned to just one path. They've built in multiple ways to actually get the oil to market and start generating cash. It's a smart hedge against the binary risks, and it bumps up the probability that something works. I'll walk you through the two main monetization routes, then the option-like payoff structure, and wrap with why this setup feels so asymmetric. Multiple monetization paths. Despite all the pushback from state and local authorities, Sable has engineered a dual-track strategy. The goal is simple: get hydrocarbons sold commercially, whether through the legacy onshore pipeline or by sidestepping it entirely offshore. First, the pipeline restart path. This is the quicker, lower-cost route if it clears. The existing system runs from the platforms through subsea lines to Las Flores Canyon, LFC, processing, then onward via lines 324 and 325 to refineries farther inland. Sable has spent years repairing, testing, adding 27 emergency shutoff valves, running smart pigs for integrity checks, all under the 2015 consent decree. Early plans targeted state fire marshal approval by late 2023 and restart by mid-2024, but Santa Barbara County blocked permit transfers, November 2025, vote to deny, and other local hurdles piled up. That's when Flores pivoted hard to federal preemption. Late 2025 breakthrough, PHMSA, federal pipeline regulator, issued an emergency special permit December 22, 2025, citing the national energy emergency, tied to Trump's EO, reclassifying segments as interstate, and approving restart with enhanced measures. Then, on December 31, 2025, the Ninth Circuit denied the Enviro Group's emergency stay request, meaning no immediate injunction blocks ops while the full merits case plays out. Expedited briefs, plaintiffs January 26, answers February 17, interveners March 3. Bottom line, federal green light overrides much of the state resistance for now. If they navigate the ongoing litigation and any remaining state consistency reviews, coastal, etc., this path could deliver first commercial sales relatively soon. Oil already flows to LFC storage from offshore production restarts in 2025. The bear case starts by recognizing that Sable has more than one way to get oil to market, which lowers the risk of total failure but doesn't eliminate it. The fastest and cheapest option is restarting the existing pipeline system that moves oil from the offshore platforms through Las Flores Canyon and on to refineries. Since the 2015 spill, Sable has repaired, tested, and upgraded the system under a federal consent decree. When California regulators and local authorities blocked progress, management pivoted to federal preemption. That strategy paid off in late 2025 when PHMSA issued an emergency permit, and the Ninth Circuit declined to halt operations, allowing the restart to proceed while litigation continues. If courts don't intervene, this remains the most direct path to near-term commercial oil sales. Second, the offshore storage/tanker path, OS&T, the true backup plan to bypass California onshore entirely. This involves deploying an offshore storage and treating vessel, or similar floating facility, right at the SYU in federal waters. Oil gets processed, stored offshore, then offloaded to shuttle tankers for direct shipment to refineries, potentially outside California, opening better pricing and markets. Sable announced this alternative in late 2025, targeting vessel acquisition in Q1 2026, modifications/installation through mid/late year, and first sales in Q4 2026 at rates potentially over 50,000 barrels per day. It's more capital-intensive, vessel costs, platform mods, etc., and slower, plus needs federal approvals, interior/BEC for OCS ops, maybe air/emissions permits. But the big edge? Jurisdiction stays mostly federal. Platforms are in federal waters, California has limited say, and preemption arguments, like with PHMSA, could carry over. If onshore gets permanently blocked, this keeps the asset alive without relying on state politics. Pursuing both in parallel maximizes odds. Pipeline for speed if federal momentum holds, OS&T as the out if state roadblocks drag on. The offshore storage and tanker plan is Sable's insurance policy. If California keeps blocking the onshore route, Sable can process and store oil offshore and ship it directly to refineries by tanker, largely staying in federal jurisdiction. This route takes longer and costs more because it requires a specialized vessel and platform modifications, but it avoids state politics and keeps the asset viable. By pursuing both the pipeline restart and the offshore tanker option at the same time, Sable improves its chances. The pipeline offers the fastest payoff if federal approvals hold, while the tanker route provides a workable fallback if state resistance continues. Option-like payoff, high upside versus potential zero. This isn't a gradual growth story, it's classic special sit binary, massive unlock or bust. Sable is pre-revenue, oil to storage only, no sales since 2015, burning cash while debt piles up. But the moment commercial flow starts, it flips to a high-margin producer fast. SOC's edge is the dual paths, pipeline for near-term speed, federal tailwind helps, OS&T for regulatory workaround, federal waters, tanker flexibility. They need key approvals, bridge financing/refinancing, and no major incidents to hit first sales. If they pull it off world-class tier, one asset online cash flowing, the stock can explode as shorts unwind and NAV unlocks. If not, time runs out on debt/reversion, the downside is total. That's the special situation math. Mispriced binary bet on execution and catalysts, not steady compounding. High conviction if you believe Flores threads the needle, his track record says he can, but zero tolerance for error. Classic high-variance play, limited ways to win big, but one good path could be transformative. This is an all-or-nothing bet. Sable isn't slowly growing a business, it's burning cash while waiting for permission to sell oil. If commercial sales start, the company can flip quickly into a high-margin producer and the stock could jump as the asset's value becomes real. If sales don't happen in time, the debt overwhelms the company and the equity goes to zero. The upside comes from having two shots on goal, the pipeline for speed and the offshore tanker plan as a workaround, but both require approvals and financing. If management executes, the payoff can be huge. If they don't, there's no soft landing. Part 6. The Jockey. James C. Flores. All right, let's talk about the man at the center of this whole Sable Offshore story, James C. Flores. In the world of energy investing, especially in tough, cyclical plays like this, people often say, bet on the jockey, not just the horse. The idea is simple. In capital-intensive, regulated industries, a proven leader who can allocate capital, time deals perfectly, fight regulators, and execute under pressure can turn a distressed asset into massive alpha. Flores embodies that wildcatter archetype more than almost anyone alive today. Right now, as chairman and CEO of Sable Offshore Corp, Flores is in the middle of his boldest move yet, resurrecting the SYU, a monster offshore California field with over 1.2 billion barrels of recoverable resources that's been dead since the 2015 Refugio spill. ExxonMobil, the biggest public energy company on Earth, couldn't restart it after a decade of California regulatory hell. Flores bought it cheap in a 2024 SPAC merger with Flame Acquisition, structured it as basically a call option on revival, and is betting everything on federal preemption to smash through local blocks. As of early January 2026, things are heating up fast. PHMSA issued an emergency special permit in late December 2025 to restart the key Las Flores onshore pipelines. Lines 324-325, citing a national energy emergency declaration under the Trump admin. Environmental groups rushed to the Ninth Circuit, for an emergency stay court denied it on December 31, 2025. But the underlying lawsuit is expedited. Briefs start rolling in late January through March 2026. Onshore restart isn't fully greenlit yet. Santa Barbara County, Coastal Commission, and state agencies are still fighting hard with fines, permit denials, and new demands for reviews. Production has technically restarted on one platform, Harmony, but full commercial flow is still pending. This isn't just an operational play, it's Flores wagering his reputation and fortune on outmaneuvering the most hostile regulatory environment in the U.S. To understand if you should bet on this jockey, you have to look at his full track record. The legendary wins, the brutal failures, and what it means for SOC's binary outcome. On the personal side, James C. Flores keeps things low-key. He's a Louisiana native and longtime Houston resident, married to Cherie Flores for decades. They were already a couple in the mid-1980s during his early career. They have 4 children. Flores is a proud LSU alum, BS in corporate finance and petroleum land management, and, with Cherie, endowed the Flores MBA program at LSU's E.J. Orso College of Business in the 1990s, still a lasting family legacy supporting education in his home state. No flashy lifestyle or public drama in the record, he's family first, quietly philanthropic, and laser-focused on the business. That stability and long-term alignment likely fuel his willingness to go all in on high-stakes bets like SYU. It's not just a deal for him. It's tied to legacy. As of January 7, 2026, with the Ninth Circuit denying the emergency stay in Harmony platform production technically restarted, though full commercial flow is still pending, the jockey is riding hard toward what could be his biggest win yet, or another brutal wipeout. To understand the odds of success with Sable Offshore Corp, you really have to look at the man driving it, Jim Flores, and his full professional arc. He's not your standard major oil company suit. Flores is a classic wildcatter, deal-savvy, litigation-ready, leverage-hungry, and always hunting for mispriced assets. The bet the jockey case here rests on his track record of massive wins, painful wipeouts, and a philosophy built around agency, timing, and aggressive capital deployment. Let's break it down step by step by walking through his career highlights. 1. The philosophy of the jockey agency. Risk and the wildcatter mindset. Flores doesn't play small ball. He's a throwback to the old school independence, master of timing acquisitions at the bottom, bulldozing regulatory barriers with legal firepower, and engineering creative, sometimes high-wire, financing. Think SPACs, seller-financed high-interest notes, PIK toggles, and heavy insider alignment. That alignment is real here. He personally put up $25 million to help close the original SPAC deal when others hesitated. As of recent filings, through mid-2024, with no major sales reported since, he holds around 10.6 million shares in Sable Offshore, roughly 10 to 11% ownership. At various points in 2025-2026 pricing, that stake has been valued north of $60 to $100 million, depending on share price swings. That's genuine skin in the game downside exposure that motivates him to fight hard. But it cuts both ways. High personal stakes can lead to gambling for resurrection moves, like accepting 15% interest on the Exxon loan extension or pushing hard on restarts amid regulatory fire. 2. Early days. Building the foundation. Flores got his start in the late 1980s/early 90s amid the post-1986 oil crash. He co-founded Flores and Rux, Inc. in Louisiana, scooping up mature, distressed fields that the majors were dumping at fire sale prices. They squeezed out incremental production through smart ops and acquisitions. The company went public in 1994. By 1997, it rebranded to Ocean Energy Inc. and merged with United Meridian Corporation in 1998, adding Gulf, North Dakota, and even early West Africa exposure. Another merger followed with Sable Energy in 1999. Classic roll-up strategy: aggregate assets, build scale, boost cash flow, and position for bigger plays. It established his reputation as a dealmaker who could grow independence fast. 3. The masterpiece: Plains exploration and production. This is the chapter that made him a legend. In 2001, he took over as chairman and CEO of Plains Resources Inc. He spun off its E&P assets into a pure-play upstream company, Plains Exploration and Production, in 2002, then went on an aggressive acquisition tear. 2003, bought 3 tech energy added Gulf of Mexico exposure. 2004, acquired Nuevo Energy, massive consolidation of California heavy oil assets, foreshadowing Santa Ynez. 2007, landed the transformational Pogo producing deal. Huge scale-up, followed by smart non-core sales. Plains exploration and production grew production and reserves dramatically over a decade. Then, in 2013, he timed the exit perfectly. Sold it to Freeport-McMoRan for about $20 billion, cash plus stock, when WTI was hovering around $95/BLL. 18 months later, oil crashed below $50. Shareholders dodged the downside bullet. Textbook top tick, sale proof of his buy low, sell high timing superpower. 4. The Icarus Fall. Freeport-McMoRan oil and gas post-merger. Flores became vice chairman of Freeport-McMoRan and chairman/CEO of its oil and gas subsidiary. The deal saddled Freeport-McMoRan with about $20 billion in added debt just as the commodity supercycle peaked and reversed. Oil prices tanked, mining troubles compounded, and Freeport-McMoRan hit crisis mode. Dividend cuts, forced asset sales at depressed prices, massive restructuring. Flores stepped down in 2016 amid the fallout. It tarnished the shine, showing how his aggressive, leverage-heavy style can amplify destruction when macro conditions turn vicious. High risk can mean epic wins or epic losses. Flores' career is a roller coaster of aggregation wins. Ocean energy, plains exploration and production, perfect cycle timing, 2013 exit, and brutal downturn pain, Freeport-McMoRan era. At Sable Offshore, he's applying the same playbook: distressed asset grab, Santa Ynez from Exxon, heavy personal skin, regulatory warfare, creative financing, and a bet on restarting legacy infrastructure in a high-price environment. The odds? If oil stays supportive, regulations bend, or get bulldozed federally, and the aging pipes/valves hold under pressure, this could be another plains exploration and production style masterpiece. But if the regulatory gauntlet drags on, a spill/incident happens, or prices weaken, it risks echoing the Freeport-McMoRan downside. That's why betting on Flores is betting on the jockey, not the horse alone. High conviction, high variance. 5. The red flag, Sable Permian Resources bankruptcy. This chapter is the biggest cautionary tale in Flores' career, the one that proves even a legendary jockey can crash hard when leverage meets a brutal market downturn. Sable Permian Resources, SPR, originated from the remnants of Aubrey McClendon's American Energy Permian Basin, a spin-off after McClendon's 2016 death and prior Chesapeake fallout. In 2017, it restructured and emerged as Sable Permian, with Flores stepping in as chairman, CEO, and president to try to turn around the debt-heavy Permian Wolfcamp shale operator. The hope was his deal-making and operational skills could pare debt, cut costs, and optimize production in a tough post-2014 shale environment. But the setup was already precarious. Complex capital structure with multiple tranches of debt held by sophisticated players like the Energy and Minerals Group, EMG, Onyx Point Global Management, and others. Flores attempted an out-of-court restructuring in 2019 to manage the load amid lingering low oil prices, but it wasn't enough. Then came the double hammer. The 2020 COVID-19 demand collapse sent oil prices negative in April, devastating cash flows for leveraged E&Ps. SPR couldn't service its obligations or grow out of trouble. On June 25, 2020, Sable Permian Resources, LLC, and affiliates filed voluntary Chapter 11 petitions in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas, Houston Division, Case 20-33193. Filings showed roughly $1.32 billion in total debt, including about $575 million revolving credit and about $744 million long-term notes, 127,600 acres in the core southern Midland Basin Wolfcamp play, but no liquidity to weather the storm. The company secured $150 million in debtor-in-possession (DIP) financing to keep operating during restructuring. The process was contentious. All employees were laid off post-filing as operations wound down. Bondholders/creditors pushed back hard, including scrutiny of executive compensation floors, reportedly sought a significant payout or bonus tied to performance, but it was denied or fought off amid creditor objections. Some reports and distressed analysts, e.g., from Silverback Asset Management, later criticized management harshly, calling the asset base mediocre, drilling overly dense, sacrificing long-term value for short-term results, and overall operations poorly run or even scammy in tone. Filings included lists of putative defendants for potential claims, with Flores and other execs named in connection to possible mismanagement or fiduciary issues, though no major public settlements or judgments against him. Equity was wiped out entirely, control passed to senior secured creditors. The company emerged from Chapter 11 on February 1, 2021, under a third amended joint plan of reorganization and liquidation, reorganized but under new ownership/name, with Flores no longer in charge. Key lesson for Sable investors. This wasn't just bad luck, it highlighted the limits of Flores's playbook. When you can't drill/grow your way out, due to price crash plus high fixed costs plus leverage, and regulatory/market conditions don't bend, aggressive strategies can lead to total equity destruction. No heroic exit like PXP, instead, a messy wipeout that left creditors in charge and raised questions about execution in prolonged downturns. It underscores why SOC's current setup, federal preemption bet, seller-financed debt with reversion risk, binary restart outcome, carries real jockey risk. Flores has the skin and conviction, but history shows his style can go to zero when the macro turns hostile. Okay, let's keep rolling with this breakdown of Sable Offshore and why it's such a classic Flores redemption story. 6. Sable Offshore. The redemption play. Picture this. Jim Flores sees one of the juiciest distressed assets in the U.S. energy space just sitting there. Santa Ynez Unit, 3 giant fixed platforms. Hondo, Harmony, Heritage, mothballed since the ugly 2015 Refugio spill dumped over 140,000 gallons into the Pacific. He jumps on it through the Flame acquisition SPAC. They raised about $287 million, closes the deal in 2024, and buys the whole thing from Exxon for roughly $625 million, mostly seller-financed, with a 5-year note that's now carrying around 15% PIK interest. Smart structure, low cash outlay, big upside if it works. PIK, by the way, is payment-in-kind interest, which is rather than writing interest checks, Sable lets the debt grow over time. That preserves cash in the short term, but it makes the loan bigger and more expensive the longer it's outstanding, especially painful once the interest rate is high, like about 15%. But here's the knife-edge part, the reversion clause. If they don't achieve restart production, meaning actual commercial sales of oil and gas, by March 1, 2026, the assets flip back to Exxon for $0. We're talking a $622 million loan that could evaporate. High stakes. Fast forward offshore, things are moving. They started ramping production in phases back in May 2025. First Harmony platform, about 6,000 barrels a day from 6 wells, flowing to Las Flores Canyon storage but no sales yet. Then Heritage in July, Hondo in August. The well tests? Better than pre-shut-in numbers. A decade offline actually helped repressurization on this heavy sour crude means lower decline rates and solid recovery. They're on a path to maybe 28,000 BE early on, scaling toward the historical peak of 45,000 BE day across all 112 wells. At $70 Brent, which is supportive right now, that full run rate could throw off $400, $600 million in annualized earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. From zero revenue today to about $3 million a day in cash flow? That's the dream. The bottleneck? Those onshore pipelines, lines 324 and 325, 8 miles subsea to Las Flores Canyon, then another 120 miles inland to the refineries. Right now, oil's just sitting in storage at LFC. No commercial transit, no money in the door. 7. The battlefield right now. The 2015 spill didn't just make a mess, it created a permanent scar in Santa Barbara. Beaches closed for 150 miles. Fisheries took a hit. Locals got radical. Fast forward, Santa Barbara County flat out denied permit transfers back on December 16, 2025, citing Chapter 25B operator capability. Coastal Commission slapped an $18 million fine in April 2025 for unpermitted repair work and multiple cease and desist violations. Then SB 237 passed in September 2025, basically says if you've been idled more than 5 years and didn't restart before January 1, 2026, you need a full coastal development permit. State AG has civil charges pending. County DA has criminal misdemeanor probes over the Gaviota work. Arraignment was February 24, still hanging. In simple terms, Sable is fighting on hostile ground shaped by the fallout from the 2015 spill. The accident hardened local opposition, damaged beaches and fisheries, and turned Santa Barbara into a no-tolerance environment for offshore oil. Since then, state and local authorities have stacked new barriers. The county blocked key permit transfers, the Coastal Commission fined Sable heavily for repair work, and new state law, SB 237, raised the bar by requiring full coastal permits for long-idle pipelines. On top of that, both civil and criminal cases are still hanging over the company. The result is a crowded legal and regulatory battlefield where multiple agencies can slow, fine, or prosecute Sable at the same time, even as it tries to restart operations. Flores didn't back down. He went full federal preemption. Argued the Pipeline Safety Act gives PHMSA exclusive control over interstate lines. They even flipped the old 2016 intrastate classification. PHMSA greenlit the restart plan December 22, 2025, then dropped an emergency special permit on December 23, docket PHMSA 2025-1502. Good for 6 months, renewable, backed by the Trump-era National Energy Emergency Executive Order, waived normal notice and environmental assessment. They installed 27 emergency shutoff valves and ran smart pigs to prove the 35-year-old steel is sound. One of the big wins is the Ninth Circuit on December 31, 2025, denied the environmental group's EDC, Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, emergency stay request. Operations can keep going while the full merits case plays out. Briefing is expedited, plaintiffs open January 26th, Sable and PHMSA answer February 17th, interveners March 3rd. Sable and Pacific Pipeline jumped in as interveners. By the way, the Ninth Circuit is the federal appeals court that oversees California and has the power to stop or allow Sable's restart while the legal fight plays out. When it denied the emergency stay, it chose not to freeze operations, meaning PHMSA's federal approval stays in effect and Sable can continue moving forward for now. In practical terms, the court kept the system running during litigation instead of shutting it down first and sorting out the legal arguments later. Flores stopped trying to win permission from California and took the fight to Washington. He argued that federal law gives the pipeline regulator, PHMSA, sole authority over interstate pipelines, and PHMSA agreed, reclassifying the line and approving a restart. Because the government declared a national energy emergency, PHMSA was able to fast-track an emergency permit and bypass the usual slow review process. Sable also made physical upgrades and inspections to show the pipeline is safe. The key legal win came when the Ninth Circuit refused to block operations while lawsuits continue, meaning Sable can move forward for now, as the case is argued on an accelerated schedule. The remaining gating items are not abstract, they're specific choke point permissions. Key obstacles include 1. A Coastal Development Permit, CDP, pathway under SB 237 for long-idled onshore pipelines. 2. A state parks/state lands easement posture for the coastal segment where repairs and access are required. And 3. The CZMA federal consistency fight with the Coastal Commission that can slow or constrain the effectiveness of federal actions. Even with federal safety authority, these state hooks can materially delay sustained commercial operations. But the bear traps are everywhere. Santa Barbara Superior Court, Judge Geck, kept the injunction in place after the January 7th hearing. Sable had to admit, no commercial oil has moved through the onshore lines yet. That triggered SB 237 CDP requirement, 30 to 60 plus day review. Coastal is demanding it apply to the PHMSA permit. Next hearing, February 27th. No restart possible without state parks easement for the 4-mile coastal section, corrosion repairs, plus the CDP. Coastal Commission letter, January 6th. They're asserting CZMA federal consistency review. 30 plus days, clock hasn't even started because no materials submitted. And claiming the PHMSA ESP is effectively stayed until they finish. Santa Barbara County supervisors held a closed session January 5th on the litigation. Fire chief says there's a 24-hour notice agreement for any flow never got. 1. No visible onshore movement. 1 leak or incident? Instant shutdown. The 2015 consent decree is still lurking. Federal side has momentum, especially in the Trump energy dominance environment, but state and local agencies, Parks, Coastal, OSFM, plus the Ninth Circuit Merits Review, could drag full sales out weeks or months. Backup plan. Offshore storage and treating vessel acquire in Q1, install late 2026, offload to tankers, potentially greater than 50,000 back a day without relying on the pipelines. 8. The financial asymmetry. This stock behaves like a coin flip with a big payoff on one side and a wipeout on the other. After the Ninth Circuit ruling, the stock jumped hard, then fell back just as quickly when new state resistance and oil market worries surfaced. That kind of violent swing tells you the market sees this as a binary situation, not a steady business. If Sable clears the remaining legal and financing hurdles and starts selling oil, the upside could be several times today's price, because the asset would suddenly generate real cash flow. If it doesn't, because of delays, court reversals, another incident, or running out of time on expensive debt, the company burns cash fast and the stock could collapse. There's very little middle ground, which is why the volatility is so extreme. Flores has played this brilliantly to date, snagged a Tier 1 asset at 10 to 20% of what it was once worth, forced a federal override against hardcore California environmental opposition, scored the PHMSA emergency permit and the Ninth Circuit no-stay win. That's real execution. But his career is nothing if not binary. Think Plains exploration and production masterpiece versus the Freeport-McMoran wipeout or the earlier Sable Permian struggles. No commercial sales yet, just storage at LFC. March 1st clock is ticking loud. The bet is whether Flores can thread the needle, renew the PHMSA permit, use the OS&T vessel as a bridge if needed, and keep everything leak-free in this Trump-era tailwind. If the pipes flow clean and sales start, this could be another legendary turnaround. 1 regulatory block, 1 seal failure, 1 drip in the wrong place. It's over. High variance redemption play, about $3 million a day potential hanging in the balance. Classic Flores, massive personal skin, north of $100 million stake, creative leverage, non-stop litigation. You're not betting the asset alone, you're betting on the jockey to keep this bucking horse from throwing him. Flores has executed masterfully so far, snagged a world-class distressed asset at a bargain, structured enormous upside optionality, and navigated federal preemption against fierce California opposition. Recent PHMSA permit and Ninth Circuit denial mark real progress toward restart. But his history is binary. Epic aggregations and top-tick exits, Plains exploration and production, versus leverage-fueled wipeouts, Freeport-McMoran era, Sable Permian struggles. Investors aren't just betting on oil prices or reservoirs, they're betting Flores threads the needle without a fatal regulatory, operational, or incident error. This is a high-risk, high-reward bet on execution. If the pipelines operate safely and oil sales begin, Sable could generate significant cash flow and turn into a major turnaround success. But there's no margin for error. 1 regulatory setback, operational failure, or spill could end the story quickly. A large part of the thesis rests on Jim Flores himself. He has put substantial personal capital at risk, has already pulled off a difficult acquisition, and has made real progress navigating federal approvals. At the same time, his track record includes both big wins and painful losses. Investors here aren't just betting on the asset, they're betting that Flores can manage the legal, operational, and political risks without making a single critical mistake. Part 7. The Reluctant Banker. The ExxonMobil safety net. The Exxon note is the core risk, and many bullish write-ups understate it. VIC commentary has correctly focused on this issue. The maturity is clear. Sable extended its deadline to March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first sales, whichever is earlier, by raising $250 million in November 2025 at a much higher interest rate. As a result, the real clock starts once oil sales begin because the company must refinance immediately to avoid crushing interest costs. The downside risk is real. The purchase agreement with Exxon has teeth, and the restart failure date has already passed. As of early January 2026, Exxon sits in a position of leverage with the contractual ability to take the asset back and effectively force a wind-down. Even if Exxon has no interest in operating these assets in California, that option gives it negotiating power. It can demand higher interest, fees, equity, tighter covenants, or more control in exchange for time. Any upside depends on how this leverage is resolved. This section of the Sable Offshore story is the one that separates casual bulls from the realists, and it's where the bear case gets its teeth. Most upbeat write-ups hype the reserves, the federal wins, PHMSA permit, Ninth Circuit no stay, the dual paths, pipeline plus OS&T, and Flores track record. They treat Exxon as a background lender, but Exxon isn't just the seller. It's the senior secured creditor with a senior lien on essentially everything, and it's wielding that power aggressively. The financing terms are the fulcrum. Everything else, permits, production ramp, court rulings, only matters to the extent it strengthens SOC's hand in dealing with Exxon. The real risk isn't geology or permits, it's Exxon. Sable bought time by raising money in late 2025, but it came at a very high interest cost, so the moment oil sales start, the pressure to refinance becomes immediate. Exxon isn't just a passive lender in the background, it holds the senior claim on the entire asset and has the contractual right to take it back if things go wrong. That gives Exxon enormous leverage in negotiations, whether it wants higher interest, more equity, tighter control, or all of the above. This is where the bull and bear cases truly split. All the permits, court wins, and restart plans only matter if they improve Sable's bargaining position with Exxon. If they don't, Exxon, not shareholders, decides how much value survives. The maturity clock is real and it's ticking differently than it looks in November 2025. Amendment announced November 3rd, effective after conditions met around November 24th. Sable bought time. They raised about $250 million in equity, private placement at about $5.50/share, dilutive and painful, to satisfy the condition for an amendment to the Exxon senior secured term loan. That pushed the maturity to the earlier of March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first commercial sales of hydrocarbons. The image shows Sable walking across a narrow bridge between two cliffs. On the left is financial distress, the risk of default if the loan wasn't amended. In the middle are the costs of survival, negotiating an extension, accepting a much higher 15% interest rate, and agreeing to a minimum cash covenant. On the right is temporary stability, not success, just avoidance of default. The key point the picture makes is that the bridge only exists because Sable paid a high price, dilution and expensive debt, and it's narrow because one misstep sends them back toward the cliff. The higher interest doesn't solve the problem, it just buys time while making the ultimate payoff harder. On paper, March 2027 feels like breathing room. In practice, it's a double-edged sword. The moment sales start, whether via pipeline restart or OS&T tanker offload, the fuse shortens dramatically 90 days to pay off or refinance the whole thing. About $900 million plus principal with accrued PIK interest. Sable can't afford to run at 15% interest long term. That would add roughly $200 million plus in extra carry by 2027, pushing the total toward $1.1 billion plus. They need to refinance well before then, ideally right around or shortly after first sales. Sable didn't fix its debt problem in November 2025, it delayed it. By raising $250 million and agreeing to much higher interest, the company pushed the deadline out to March 2027, but only on paper. In reality, the moment oil sales begin, the clock speeds up because Sable has just 90 days to refinance a very expensive loan that's growing fast. Keeping 15% debt outstanding would bleed hundreds of millions of dollars, so refinancing quickly is mandatory, not optional. The takeaway is that the real deadline isn't 2027. It's shortly after first oil, when Sable must convince lenders to refinance or face losing control of the asset. The partial restart already triggered acceleration back in May 2025, when Harmony restarted and flowed to LFC storage, not yet commercial sales. It tripped an acceleration clause, maturity snapped to January 2026, Sable couldn't pay, so they negotiated the extension. But it cost them interest up from 10% to 15%, compounded annually, PIK at election, plus a new covenant for minimum $25 million unrestricted cash at month end. Every month they miss that, risk default. At a $25.40 monthly burn, cash is not a vague concern. It defines the timeline. Even after the late 2025 equity raise, the practical runway is measured in months, not years. Absent meaningful revenue or new financing, Sable risks tripping the $25 million minimum cash covenant and entering a creditor-driven endgame before the legal process naturally resolves. When Sable restarted part of the system in May 2025 and sent oil to storage, but not to market, it accidentally triggered a clause in its loan that pulled the debt deadline forward. Sable couldn't pay, so it had to renegotiate. The price of that extra time was steep. The interest rate jumped to 15%, and the company agreed it must always have at least $25 million in cash. Miss that cash minimum even once, and it risks default. In short, restarting without selling oil made the debt more expensive and put Sable on a very tight monthly leash. The restart failure date passed. Exxon now has the reversion hammer. The original purchase and sale agreement, PSA, defined a restart production deadline commercial sales by around March 1, 2026. Some early filings referenced January 1st or similar, but March 1st is cited consistently in later disclosures. Full commercial transit hasn't happened yet. Onshore lines still not moving oil commercially per early January 2026. Admissions in court docs. Technically, the reversion option is live or imminent unless waived/extended. Exxon doesn't want the assets back. They spent years trying to exit California offshore, but they hold the cudgel. They can threaten reassignment without compensation, forcing wind down, or blocking further extensions unless terms improve for them. It's negotiating power, not desire to operate. Sable was supposed to reach full commercial sales by around March 1, 2026. That hasn't happened yet, which means Exxon now holds a powerful option. It can legally take the assets back or threaten to do so. Exxon doesn't actually want to operate these assets again, but that's not the point. The threat gives Exxon leverage in negotiations. It can demand better terms, more control, or more value in exchange for extending deadlines. This isn't about Exxon wanting the oil, it's about Exxon using its contractual rights to dictate the outcome if Sable can't move fast enough. Exxon, as the reluctant banker with asymmetric leverage, Exxon isn't hostile for fun, they're rational. They want their money back, plus premium for the risk, and they can wait. Sable can't burn is $25 to $40 million per month range, liquidity tight around the $25 million covenant. Exxon has already extracted concessions, $4 million per month payments, starting about June 2025, until certain permit transfers complete, operating permit, etc. Steady cash drain, P&A, plugging and abandonment, bonding. $350 million financial security, bond/LOC, now due, 3 business days after loan maturity. March 31, 2027 or 90 days post-sales. Up from original timing. Exxon can push it to $500 million under conditions. Every delay or setback gives Exxon another opening. Higher rates, fees, tighter covenants, more dilution, warrants, or governance tweaks. All of it comes out of equity value. Exxon is playing hardball because it can afford to, and Sable can't. Exxon isn't trying to punish Sable, it's protecting its money and getting paid for the risk. While Exxon can wait, Sable is burning tens of millions of dollars a month and has very little cash cushion. Exxon has already locked in monthly payments, accelerated large cleanup bonding requirements, and moved deadlines forward. Each delay gives Exxon more leverage to demand better terms, higher interest, more fees, stricter rules, or more ownership. Every one of those concessions reduces what's left for shareholders. The longer this drags on, the more value shifts from Sable's equity to Exxon. Bulls say, clear hurdles, then sales start, then massive EBITDA, the refinance in strong markets, and finally, equity explodes. Bears counter, even if ops succeed, Exxon controls the refinance conversation. No junior lender touches this while Exxon's senior. Refinancing requires Exxon's cooperation, takeout or subordination. If markets are soft or Sable has weak alternatives, Exxon dictates punitive terms, transferring upside via fees, equity slices, or other grabs. Believers in the company believe that once oil sales start, The cash flow will be so strong that refinancing becomes easy and the stock takes off. Bears argue that this ignores who's really in charge, Exxon. Because Exxon sits at the top of the capital structure, no new lender will step in without Exxon's consent. Even if operations go well, refinancing still requires Exxon to cooperate. If markets are weak or Sable has limited options, Exxon can set harsh terms that shift much of the upside away from shareholders and toward itself. Equity only wins if Sable arrives at the refinance moment with real bargaining power. Durable federal path. PHMSA renewable OS&T approvals. Multiple monetization routes, external lender interest, and no major incidents. That weakens Exxon's squeeze incentive. They'd rather get repaid cleanly than force a mess. This isn't about Exxon being mean, it's about relative power. The loan is the existential fulcrum. Production headlines matter, but refinancing terms matter more. If Sable gets there with options, Trump-era federal tailwind helps, Exxon likely facilitates an exit. If not, if delays persist, liquidity bites, or alternatives fizzle, Exxon wins big, and equity gets vaporized. Default, reversion, wipeout. That's why this remains investable, but never comfortable. High variance bet on Flores, threading the needle legally/operationally while diffusing the debt bomb. The bear case is structurally strong because Exxon controls time, and time is SOC's enemy. Classic special sit, asymmetric upside if the jockey outmaneuvers the banker, but razor-thin margin for Part 8, the strategic pivot. The OS&T solution. Okay, so let's chat about this OS&T plan. Sable's real plan B, when California's state and local regulators keep throwing up roadblocks on the onshore pipeline restart. It's not what they'd prefer, the pipeline is simpler and cheaper, but it's a legitimate fallback. And as of right now, early January 2026, with zero commercial sales happening yet, just offshore production flowing to storage at Las Flores Canyon. This offshore route is absolutely still in play and looking more relevant by the day. A critical friction point is federal environmental review. Even if jurisdiction is federal, opponents can challenge approvals under NEPA/ESA style theories, or demand supplemental review, turning the OS&T path into a procedural battlefield similar to other high-profile pipeline fights. Practically, that means the offshore workaround may be legally cleaner than California permitting, but not litigation-proof, and timing risk remains a first-order variable. What does OS&T actually involve? The whole point is to keep everything offshore in federal waters, beyond the 3-mile line, so no crude ever touches California's soil or state-controlled waters. Sable would bring in a floating storage and treatment vessel, basically a big moored ship, often a converted tanker or something FPSO style, positioned near the 3 platforms: Hondo, Harmony, and Heritage. Crude comes up from the wells, gets piped or hosed over to the vessel. There it goes through the same basic processing you see topside: 3-phase separation to pull out the water and gas, stabilize the oil, and store it in the vessel's tanks. Every few days or weeks, shuttle tankers pull alongside, load up the stabilized crude, and haul it away straight to refineries or terminals, potentially completely outside California for better netbacks and to avoid local politics. This isn't some untested idea for Santa Ynez. Exxon actually did exactly this back in the day. From 1981 to 1994, they ran an offshore storage and treatment facility, they called it OSTF, using a converted tanker on a single anchor mooring, about 3.5 miles offshore. It handled over 160 million barrels without major incidents. Importantly, the platforms still have a lot of the legacy infrastructure in place, things like a 12-inch subsea pipeline and utility lines that could be reactivated or tied into a new setup relatively quickly. Why this is such a powerful workaround? Here's the killer advantage: jurisdiction flips to federal. The platforms sit in Outer Continental Shelf, federal waters, so the rules come from the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. The main players are BOM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, handles the overall plan approvals and leasing. BSE, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Safety, Environmental Compliance, Spill Response Plans. U.S. Coast Guard, tanker operations, mooring safety, navigation, oil spill readiness. California state agencies, Coastal Commission, Santa Barbara County, State Fire Marshal, they have almost no direct say. No onshore permits required, no coastal zone pipeline impacts, no SB 237 CDP nonsense. Even if the Coastal Commission tries to throw a Coastal Zone Management Act consistency objection, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce can override it on national interest grounds. It's happened before, though it usually invites lawsuits. And Sable could ship the crude to ports or refineries outside California entirely, dodging state taxes, local reviews, or refinery politics. In today's federal environment, pro-energy priorities in Washington, approvals look a lot friendlier. Sable's already been talking to people in D.C., including the National Energy Dominance Council, and the company is pretty confident they'll get what they need from federal regulators. The trade-offs? Slower and more expensive no ones. Pretending this is as good as restarting the existing pipeline. Management has been upfront. Going the tanker route stretches the timeline and jacks up costs significantly. Rough timeline if they pivot. Submit revised development and production plan to BOOM/BCE, go through full environmental impact statement EIS review, even if expedited, that's realistically 12+ months. Secure and deliver the vessel, lease or buy/convert, targeting contract by late 2025, early 2026. Installation around Q3 2026. Platform modifications, mooring/buoy setup. First commercial offloads. Likely Q4 2026, with capacity for greater than 50,000 barrels per day once fully ramped. Costs: vessel lease alone could run $100,000 $200,000 per day. Shuttle tanker ops, weather downtime, extra transfer steps, all push OPEX up by roughly $5 $8 per barrel compared to pipeline. Upfront capex probably $100 million plus in 2026. It's less efficient than a fixed pipeline, but it's doable and proven on this exact field. If Sable has to switch to offshore storage and tankers, it's a slow and expensive path. They would need new federal approvals, line up and modify a specialized vessel, and make offshore and subsea changes before oil can be sold. Even moving fast, that likely means no meaningful revenue until late 2026. The setup works and has been done before, but it costs a lot more than a pipeline and takes time that Sable doesn't have much of. The real risks here: cash burn drag. No revenue for another 9-12+ months means the monthly burn, $25 to $40 million range, keeps eating liquidity. The $25 million cash covenant is already tight. Big equity raise or partner could mean dilution. Exxon note pressure. 15% PIK interest. Maturity at the earlier of March 31, 2027 or 90 days after first sales. A long delay could force another extension or concessions from Exxon. Execution and ops complexity. Tight vessel market, conversion timelines, marine ops risks, weather, spills, potential federal enviro lawsuits, EIS challenges, ESA issues. The 1980s tankering drew fierce local opposition over spill fears. Some of that sentiment could resurface. Going concern flags. Management has already warned about substantial doubt without timely sales or funding. OS&T buys survival time but amps up the financing hurdles. The biggest danger is running out of cash before this backup plan pays off. With no revenue for another 9 to 12 months, Sable keeps burning tens of millions of dollars a month and is already close to its minimum cash requirement. Delays increase pressure from Exxon, which holds very expensive debt that comes due soon after sales start. On top of that, offshore tankering is operationally complex and politically sensitive, and new lawsuits or environmental challenges could slow things further. In short, the tanker route can keep the project alive, but it raises financing risk and leaves little room for mistakes. Why it's still a smart backstop. If the pipeline stays blocked, SB 237 CDP delays, coastal demands, injunctions, ongoing litigation, OS&T keeps the asset breathing. It monetizes 112 wells, unlocks the about 45K barrels per day potential, and protects billions in NAV. It also flips the power dynamic. California loses tax revenue, jobs, and supply leverage, while Sable gains negotiating muscle. Federal backing could even include credit support or direct help. Bottom line: OS&T isn't the dream scenario. It trades economics for regulatory freedom, but it's credible, has historical precedent on this exact field, and give Sable a real way forward if state politics remain hostile. As of January 8, 2026, with commercial flow still stalled onshore, this contingency is what keeps the upside alive. Part 9. Why it can still work. Sable's only interesting if a handful of specific catalysts hit in time. If none of them do, we're looking at a slow burn to zero, like Veneco back in 2017 when the same pipeline issues stranded their platform. So the thesis boils down to needing at least one of these four things to break right, and soon. First up, the pipeline restart and getting to actual sales. This is the cleanest path. They restarted production May 15, 2025, about 6,000 barrels a day from 6 wells on Harmony platform. That's real oil after a decade shut-in, but none of it's sold yet. It's just filling those 540,000 barrels of storage at Las Flores Canyon, waiting for the onshore pipeline to get the green light. Late 2025, PHMSA stepped in hard, reclassified the lines as interstate, issued an emergency startup permit citing the presidential energy order. That bypassed a lot of California's holdups. If that federal approval survives the ongoing legal fights from enviro groups and state officials, Sable could start transporting and selling pretty quickly. Early tests look good too. The wells are coming back stronger than 2015 levels, when the field was doing around 45,000 BO a day. Bottom line, if regulators and courts let them move oil in the near term, cash starts flowing, the liquidity crunch eases, and refinancing the debt gets way easier. Second, Exxon extends or amends the loan. Exxon financed most of the acquisition, about $623 million of the $643 million purchase price, with a seller note that's now closer to $900 million with interest. It's secured by the asset, so Exxon basically holds the keys. The November 2025 amendment bought time maturity out to March 31, 2027, or 90 days after first sales, whichever hits first. But Exxon could still be the lifeline if they give another extension or restructure on reasonable terms. They don't want these fields back. They spent years trying to exit California. If they see pipeline progress or federal momentum, they might prefer keeping the loan alive, getting repaid cleanly, and avoiding the mess of repossessing or dealing with decommissioning. One more amendment could kill the immediate default risk and give Sable real breathing room. The financial landscape of the Santa Ynez Unit acquisition reveals a massive disparity between the billions historically sunk by ExxonMobil and the relatively small cash position of Sable Offshore. Over decades, Exxon spent upwards of $2.5 billion to develop the Heritage, Harmony, and Hondo platforms, followed by approximately $720 million just to maintain them in an idle state after the 2015 spill. In contrast, Sable acquired these assets for $643 million, but only put up about $20 million in actual cash at closing, with the remaining 97% financed by a loan from Exxon. While Sable has since spent roughly $200 million on facility refurbishment and preparing the offshore storage and treatment (OS&T) workaround, their total risk exposure of $250 million is eclipsed by Exxon's $3.5 billion total stake. This OS&T strategy is critical because it bypasses hostile California state regulators by moving operations to federal waters, where jurisdiction shifts to federal agencies like BOEM, BCE, and the U.S. Division Ship Reforms. Coast Guard. Third, the offshore/tanker route gets permitted and funded. Plan B bypass California completely with an offshore storage and treating vessel and shuttle tankers. Sable announced it formally in September 2025 as a parallel path. The idea isn't new. Santa Ynez used a similar floating system from 1981 to 1994, before the onshore facilities were ready. Everything happens in federal waters, federal regulators only. No coastal commission, no county veto. Oil processed, stored offshore, loaded onto tankers, shipped out potentially to refineries outside California. But it's capital heavy and slow. Reports say roughly $450 million for the vessel/acquisition or conversion, plus $300 million in ops costs, on top of refinancing Exxon total funding needs pushing $1.7 billion. Timeline slips first sales to late 2026 if they go this way. Sable's looking for federal support loan guarantees, infrastructure funding to make it work. The positive case is they get federal permits, looking friendly right now, line up financing without killer dilution, and unlock the field even if the pipeline stays blocked. Fourth, Flores executes. You're betting on the jockey. Jim Flores has done this before, built Plains exploration and production from nothing, sold it to Freeport-McMoRan at the cycle peak. He knows California heavy crude. He ran Freeport's oil and gas after. And he's got real skin. Roughly 8% ownership, about 11.2 million shares. His son also has ownership in the business. That's alignment. He's not sitting back. If he can navigate the regulatory maze, arrange capital, keep Exxon reasonable, and get oil-flowing pipeline or tanker, this could be his next big one. His track record and stake give you some confidence he'll fight every angle. If none of these happen, if none of these catalysts materialize, the outcome is straightforward and ugly. Sable can keep producing oil into storage for a while, but without a legal path to sell it, that oil has no economic value. Cash continues to burn, the 15% interest on the Exxon loan compounds, and the minimum cash covenant becomes harder to meet each month. Eventually, the company runs out of runway. At that point, Sable doesn't fail because the reservoir is bad or the asset is broken. It fails because it can't access a market. That is exactly what happened to Veneco. Viable production stranded by regulation, no bridge to sales, and no way to service debt. If this scenario plays out, equity holders are wiped out. The oil remains in the ground, and responsibility for decommissioning ultimately shifts back to Exxon or the state. So why would value investors own it? Li Lu from Himalaya Capital reportedly took about a 1.25% stake, small position, but meaningful for him. This is event-driven optionality, not a compounder you hold forever. The market is pricing in almost zero chance of a near-term restart or offshore solution. That's why the stock trades at a huge discount to any reasonable reserve value. If even one catalyst has better than EV odds, it's mispriced. Li Lu likely sees it as classic asymmetric payoff, small bet for big reward. Upside if oil sells and liquidity crisis lifts the stock re-rates hard, from zero revenue to strong cash flow at tens of thousands of barrels a day. Downside is capped by position size. It's Kelly-style thinking, high upside, limited downside via sizing. They aren't in love with the business today, they're buying the cheap call on the unlock event. If it materializes, the current price looks absurdly cheap in hindsight. What really matters from here? A few questions cut through everything. Can Sable legally sell oil soon? Producing without selling is a ticking clock. Oil in tanks doesn't pay bills, it just adds obligations. As of early 2026, that legal path is still in limbo. Federal authorization in December 2025 was a big win, but it's temporary and under heavy challenge. Court hearings on the pipeline continue. Without actual sales, soon finances deteriorate fast. Can they raise enough bridge money? And how much dilution? Liquidity won't last forever. They need capital to survive to sales. CEO Flores admitted on a leaked call they'd likely need up to $200 million in equity by end 2025 dilutive lifeline. They're also talking debt, government guarantees, how much cash, on what terms. If pipeline looks imminent, raising gets easier and cheaper. If not, it's distressed equity. Timing is everything. If they run out before a solution, equity's wiped. Will Exxon extend or amend? Exxon is the banker right now. Loan terms and deadlines are make or break. Not public if talks are happening, but it's the focal point. Exxon doesn't want the assets back, but they aren't a charity. Hope is they see progress and give runway. Watch 8Ks on the loan. It's pivotal. Is the tanker/offshore plan financeable on a survivable timeline? If pipeline dead ends, this is the only way. Needs big money, $750 million in new investment, and won't be quick, first sales late 2026. Can they get attractive financing? Government support? Low-cost debt? Or is it high-yield/equity that kills shareholders? Monitor financing news partners, government loans, term sheets. Feasibility is financial, not just technical. What matters less than people think? Twitter/X, noise, and celebrity commentary. Phil Mickelson rallying on X, partisan takes, Trump EO mentions, fun headlines, sentiment bumps, but they don't get oil flowing. Regulatory and capital due. California Coastal Commission drama fines, cease and desists, delays, scary press. Real, but they can't unilaterally block forever. Federal jurisdiction trumps a lot of it. Big PV, 10 or $10 billion asset value debates. Reserves are world-class, but value only matters if monetized. Market prices as if oil is worthless until sales start. Focus on go/no-go factors, not theoretical NAV. The photo of the corroded Line 901 repair after the 2015 spill says it all. That onshore pipeline was the critical path. Federal regulators claimed jurisdiction late 2025 and issued a temporary permit bypassing California opposition. Success hinges on that pipeline working or the offshore alternative stepping up. That's the story. This is Avi. Like and subscribe. On to the next.